Hi, folks. Your Works here with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. I think everyone's probably heard about it now. And it's in my view at least, the passing of an era, not simply what it represents, but what it may usher in. We're looking at a very woke climate change fanatic, King Charles III, for example, who may see his role to sort of reinvent the monarchy so it goes down well with the globalists and all the cool kids and that sort of stuff. But that remains to be seen. Coming back, though, to Elizabeth, this is somebody who, due to the length of her life and the length of her public service, she was alive, was a young woman, in fact, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the president of the United States in World War II. She was alive during the time of the Great Depression, and when Harry Truman was president, ordered the dropping of the atomic bomb. She was, again, a young woman and later queen when Winston Churchill was prime minister. So this is someone who was very much, in at the executive level at least, very much part of the history of the last century. And it was only less than 30 years before Elizabeth was born that Britain was still considered the world's premier superpower in terms of economic might and the power of its naval squadrons and so on. I mean, Britain may have been a small island with a relatively small population, but they had naval squadrons pretty much all over the world, and they could field that many naval squadrons and with the most advanced naval technology of the day. So if the Sultan of Zanzibar was still engaged in slavery on a large scale, he'd be politely asked by one of the British foreign affairs officials to stop, and often these potentates would give them the middle finger, and then shortly afterwards a fleet would appear, a few salvos on a bit of strip of dirt, and the point was made very, very quickly. You didn't fuck with those guys. So such was the power and the reach of that power, and the ability to project it and express it around the world, and that was it. And then if you wanted to do something major in the world, or country A wanted to take over country B or something, you sent people, whether it be quietly or overtly, to see if the British government would approve. And if the British government did approve, you wouldn't do it. Such was the power and influence of the time. Now, through two world wars, the British government really for probably the time of the earlier 1700s, if not even a bit earlier than that, they had a policy or a view that and at the time France was the major power, and before that Spain. They had a view that there should be a balance of power on the European continent, that no one nation should have a premier position on the continent, and the fear that the British had was if one nation managed to dominate the whole continent, they would have access to so many resources in terms of food production and raw materials and so on, that they would eventually dominate the oceans and international trade as well. Now, as time went on, that was probably a misplaced assumption. If you look at the rise of, say, Germany following federation, and into the early 1900s and so on, clearly Germany was a major power, and had a very, very sort of efficient workforce, a very efficient engineering sector, and they were surpassing the British in lots of areas such as optics, chemicals, electrical, precision engineered steel, and the list went on. So the German engineering sector was easily surpassing the British in many areas. Areas that, by the way, were key to say running a military machine. And so when World War One began, the British sort of government, I think, wanted to make sure Germany didn't control the continent, and they believed it would. The European continent believed it would if the British didn't intercede to ensure that balance of power. But the situation was that Germany was far more powerful, better organised, better run, better led. Troops were better trained. They had better equipment. Really, the British weren't in a position to take on Germany at the time, even when allied with France. They still weren't up to the task. And if you look at it, the Germans were able to, relative to casualties they received, inflict far more damage on their enemies than they received themselves, in proportion to the casualties. So the British were really struggling in that war, as indeed were the French. Now, American intervention and American wartime production tipped the balance in favour of the British and the French forces. But without that, it's pretty reasonable to assume that the German imperial forces, because they had an emperor at the time, would have prevailed in that conflict, and it was quite a close run thing a couple of times. But and then again, the British were in no condition to fight the Second World War. They were no longer commanded the resources or the will, for that matter, or the finances or the technical ability to prosecute a war. The German armed forces were superior in most everything, not absolutely everything, but in most things, and were able to achieve results with really receiving minimal casualties while inflicting severe defeats on of course, the British and the French. So Britain was in a powerless position at the end of World War II. And on top of that, the Americans had very much overestimated British wealth and also the British capacity to bounce back from the effects of that war. So the Americans really were sort of very, very intent on making sure the British didn't become commercially preeminent again, and that those benefits would flow to American manufacturers and businessmen and business interests generally. And it really was probably the late 1950s before the Americans realised that really Britain wasn't climbing out of the mire as quickly as they'd expected or imagined, and was in fact mortally wounded, if you like, in world power status terms, and may never and didn't recover its world status. So this was an important consideration, given that the Queen was only 21 or 23 or something, early 20s when she ascended to the throne. Now, at the time, the death of the king and the young Queen Elizabeth coming to the throne, it's hard to imagine how different the times were. And I guess when you look at political parties calling each other names and representing this ideology or those policies, the Queen or the monarch was always the binding force for everybody. We're all the Queen's subjects. The Queen or the King, the monarch, represents everybody and doesn't represent politics and so on. Now, the power of the monarch is, the monarch doesn't have zero power, but it's more sort of tied up in titles and ceremonial powers than real political powers. Technically, the Queen can dissolve Parliament, but given that the royal family and the monarch relies on Parliament agreeing to give them money, that may not be a particularly helpful or sensible move. But the power of the monarch really changed in what was called the Glorious Revolution, nearly 200, nearly 300 years ago, I guess, or the late 1600s, where the Parliament and the king or the monarch were sort of in a bit of a struggle as to who was boss. And so they decided to show one monarch the door and then bring in another monarch mainly because they were Protestant. But that monarch had to really agree to very limited powers. They still had powers, and those powers are gradually whittled away. But yeah, even in the early 1900s and late 1800s, it was the monarch was held in reverence. Queen Victoria and so on was held in reverence, given what was perceived as their role in British history and tradition and culture and so on. So when Elizabeth ascended the throne as a young woman, that sort of reverence of monarchy still existed. It was before the press were taking, the media were taking pot shots at the royal family and so on. And some of the younger royals didn't do themselves any favours and attracted unnecessary attention, some of it negative. So the monarchy was in the terms of the reverence and the respect for the institution was sort of gradually declining, I think, as times were changing and as socialist ideas became more accepted in the mainstream and all these sorts of things. So I think we saw quite a major decline, not only in British power, but in the esteem that all British institutions, monarchy included, had been held. And just to sort of illustrate the point of how Britain's changed, one of the left-wing newspapers that was actually, wasn't horrible to the Queen and the Queen's death and all that sort of thing, which I expected they rather would be, but they made their point in rather snide ways. They had a photograph of mourners coming to mourn the Queen's passing, and there was not one white person in the photographs that they depicted. So that was their way of making their point. It's a tragedy as much as the era that it leaves behind, and because somehow by the Queen's continuance in that role, we tended to connect the past with the present. Now that connection with the past is gone, and I see the possibility now that the monarchy, for whatever relevance it may have, that may too now be squandered on some foolish errand of wokeness or trying to make it relevant to today. And the current sort of woke environment and Britain's determination, with globalist instruction to actually destroy itself. Anyway, that's my take. The passing of an era, and I think that is, as much as the passing of anyone is, I think that too is very sad, and I don't think it can be a good thing. You've been Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.